Bram Calloway, a silent police officer, heard 3 knocks on his cabin door. When he opened it, he found a barefoot mother in the rain, holding her little girl so tightly the child could barely breathe. "Please," the mother begged, her voice trembling beneath the thunder. "Let us hide here, just for tonight." Behind them, deep in the dark Blue Ridge woods, headlights crawled slowly between the trees. Bram reached for his flashlight, but his old German shepherd, Bravo, stepped in front of him and began to growl at the storm. Then the little girl whispered something that made the officer's blood run cold. "He found us again." What made Bravo bark so differently that stormy night? Who was chasing the frightened mother and her little girl through the pouring rain? Stay with us, because what Bravo heard in that storm would lead one silent officer to the family he never knew he needed. If this story touches your heart today, please share it with someone you care about. And if you love stories about loyalty, courage, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Every subscription helps us keep sharing stories that remind us there is still good left in this world. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, just past 11 on a storm-heavy autumn night, rain swept across the dark pines and hammered the roof of an old wooden cabin as if the sky had lost patience with the earth below. Officer Bram Calloway lived alone at the end of a narrow gravel road that most people in town avoided after sunset. The road twisted through cedar trees, crossed a shallow creek, and climbed toward a cabin with one porch light, one stone chimney, and one man who rarely invited anyone inside. Bram was 42 years old, a police officer in the small mountain county of Ashford Ridge. He was still part of the force, still carried the weight of the badge, but for the past few weeks he had been placed on leave after a difficult child-related case that left him unable to sleep through the night. The town had its own opinion about him. Some said Bram was cold. Some said he had become hard. Others said he was the kind of man who could stand in a room full of people and still seem miles away. They were not entirely wrong, but they did not know that Bram had not grown quiet because he felt nothing. He had grown quiet because he had heard too much, too many frightened voices, too many late-night calls, too many moments when help arrived a few minutes after hope had already broken. That night the cabin was lit by the low orange glow of the fireplace. A kettle sat untouched on the stove. A half-read incident report rested on the kitchen table, though Bram had not turned a page in nearly an hour. He sat in an old wooden chair near the window, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt, dark work pants, and the tired expression of a man who had forgotten how to put the day down. At his feet lay Bravo, an 8-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat and the calm, watchful nature of a retired police search and rescue dog. Bravo had served beside Bram for years, finding lost hikers, missing children, and injured drivers thrown beyond the reach of headlights. He was older now, slower in the hips, and his muzzle had begun to frost with gray. But his ears still caught what human ears missed, and his instincts still moved before thought. The storm pressed harder against the windows. Wind slipped through the cracks in the old cabin and made the walls creak softly. Bram looked toward the glass, where his own reflection stared back at him from the darkness. For a moment, he thought of the child from the case that had sent him home. He closed the folder on the table and pushed it away. There were memories that did not need help returning. Bravo lifted his head. The movement was small, but Bram noticed. In all their years together, he had learned the difference between ordinary alertness and the kind of stillness that came before danger. Bravo's ears angled toward the front door. His body did not rise yet, but his breathing changed. The old dog listened past the rain, past the wind, past the rattle of the porch boards. "What is it, boy?" Bram asked quietly. Bravo stood. The fire popped behind them. Rain ran off the roof in silver ropes. Then came the sound. 3 knocks, not loud, not strong, just 3 uneven knocks against the front door, spaced like they had been made by a hand too tired to lift itself properly. Bram did not move at first. No one came to his cabin by accident. There were no neighbors close enough to wander over, no passing cars, no lost tourists this far up the ridge in weather like this. His eyes went to the clock above the stove, then back to the door. Bravo gave a low growl. It was not the sharp bark he used for wildlife near the trash bins or the warning rumble he gave when strangers stepped too close to Bram's truck. The sound came from deeper in his chest. It was controlled, steady, and serious. Bram rose from the chair. His knees felt stiff, and his shoulders carried the old ache that came from too many years of running toward other people's emergencies. He took the flashlight from the counter and moved toward the door. Bravo stepped ahead of him, placing his body between Bram and whatever waited outside. Another knock came, weaker than the first. Bram paused with his hand on the latch. "Who's there?" For a moment, only the storm answered. Then a woman's voice came through the door, thin and shaking. "Please." That single word did more than any scream could have done. Bram opened the door. Cold rain rushed into the cabin. On the porch stood Maren Vale, a 34-year-old mother from Ashford Ridge, soaked to the skin and trembling so hard she seemed held together by nothing but will. Bram had seen her once or twice in town, usually at Elma Wren's diner, always quiet, always polite, always moving as if she did not want to take up too much space in the world. In her arms was Junie Vale, her 7-year-old daughter. Junie was small for her age, with wet hair stuck to her cheeks and both arms locked around her mother's neck. She wore a thin jacket over her pajamas, and one of her shoes was missing. Her face was buried against Maren's shoulder, but Bram could see her eyes. They were wide, fixed on the darkness behind them, not on the man at the door. "Please," Maren said again, her voice trembling beneath the thunder. "Let us hide here. Just for tonight." Bram's first instinct was not heroic. It was caution. He saw wet footprints, panic, a child in the cold, and trouble standing just beyond the porch light. He was a police officer, even on leave, and every part of his training told him this was not just a lost mother asking for shelter. This was a story already in motion, and it had arrived bleeding fear across his doorstep. He looked past them into the trees. For a second, he saw nothing but rain and the wild movement of branches. Then, far down the slope where the gravel road bent near the creek, a pair of headlights appeared between the pines. They moved slowly, almost patiently, cutting through the rain like the eyes of some iron animal stalking uphill. Maren saw Bram notice them. Her breath caught. She pulled Junie closer. Bravo stepped forward. The old German shepherd did not bark. He did not lunge. He simply moved between Bram and the two soaked figures on the porch. Then, with calm certainty, he turned his body outward toward the dark road. His paws planted wide on the wooden boards, his head lowered. His growl deepened until it seemed to become part of the thunder. Junie lifted her face from her mother's shoulder. She looked at Bravo first, then at Bram. Her lips trembled before any sound came out. "He found us again," she whispered. The words entered the cabin like cold water. Bram tightened his hand around the flashlight. He wanted to ask who. He wanted to ask what had happened. He wanted to know whether there was a weapon, whether someone had called dispatch, whether this was a custody dispute, a threat, a mistake, or the beginning of something worse. But Junie's voice stopped him. It carried the worn-out fear of a child who had already learned that hiding was sometimes the only plan left. Bram looked at Maren. She was not asking him to solve her whole life. Not yet. She was asking for a door that would close behind her and stay closed for one night. Behind him, the cabin was warm. In front of him, the storm crawled with headlights. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Maren did not move right away, as if kindness had become so unfamiliar that she needed a moment to recognize it. Then she crossed the threshold with Junie in her arms. Water dripped from their clothes onto the wooden floor. Bram shut the door behind them and turned the deadbolt with a steady click. Bravo remained facing the door. Bram led Maren and Junie toward the fireplace. He pulled a blanket from the back of the couch and handed it to Maren. Then he took another from the old trunk near the wall and held it out to Junie. The little girl hesitated before accepting it. She kept one hand twisted in her mother's sleeve. "You're safe for now," Bram said. He did not know if that was a promise he had the right to make. But he said it anyway because sometimes a frightened child did not need a perfect truth. She needed a place to breathe. Maren sat on the edge of the couch, still holding Junie close. Her eyes kept moving to the windows. "We should not have come here," she whispered. "If he knows we came this way, he will not stop." Bram looked toward the front door, where Bravo stood like a guard carved from shadow and firelight. "What is his name?" Bram asked. Maren swallowed, but she did not answer. Not yet. Outside, the headlights disappeared behind the trees. The engine could no longer be heard over the rain, but Bravo did not relax. His body stayed rigid. His ears stayed forward. He had already made a decision that Bram himself had not fully reached. The dog had chosen them. And in that old cabin above the rain-soaked valley, Bram Calloway understood that the quiet life he had built around his pain had just been interrupted by a mother, a child, and a danger still moving somewhere in the dark. Down in Ashford Ridge, beneath the flickering sign of a small roadside diner, Alma Wren was wiping the same clean counter for the third time that night. Alma was 67 years old, the owner of Wren's Diner, and the kind of woman who remembered what every regular ordered before they sat down. She had not seen Maren or Junie in several days. That bothered her. Maren never missed the Thursday soup special unless something was wrong. Junie never passed the front window without waving at the little ceramic rooster Alma kept near the register. But their booth had stayed empty, and the absence had begun to feel less like coincidence and more like a warning. Alma looked out at the rain sliding down the diner glass. The street was nearly empty. The mountains beyond town were hidden in darkness. She reached for the phone, then stopped. She did not know who to call yet. She only knew that somewhere out there a mother and child had vanished from their usual place in the world. Back on the mountain, Bram stood by the window with the lights off and the flashlight cold in his hand. Maren and Junie sat close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, trying to stop shaking. Bravo remained near the door, silent and unblinking. The storm rolled over the Blue Ridge like an old drumbeat, and for the first time in weeks, Bram was no longer listening to the ghosts of the past. He was listening to the danger outside his door. Bram Calloway did not turn the lights back on right away. The cabin stayed dim, lit mostly by the fireplace and the gray flash of rain against the windows. That was how he wanted it. Bright lights made frightened people feel exposed, and Bram had spent enough years as a police officer to know that fear did not always speak clearly when a room felt like an interrogation. Maren Vale sat on the edge of the couch with Junie pressed against her side. Maren was 34, a mother who looked as if she had been running on instinct longer than strength. Her wet hair clung to her face, and her hands kept moving over Junie's shoulders, checking, holding, counting, silently, as if she needed to make sure her child was still real. Junie, 7 years old, small and soaked in her thin pajamas, hid half her face beneath the blanket Bram had given her. She did not look at him. She looked at the floorboards, at the fire, at Bravo, and then back to her mother's sleeve. Bravo remained near the front door. The 8-year-old German shepherd had lowered himself to the floor, but he was not resting. His body stretched across the path between the living room and the porch. His ears stayed lifted. His eyes stayed on the door. Every few seconds his nose worked softly, drawing in the smells that slipped through the cracks with the rain. Wet pine, mud, cold metal, gasoline fading somewhere down the hill. Bram watched him and understood enough to stay careful. "I'm going to get you something warm," Bram said. Maren looked up quickly. The sudden movement made Junie flinch. Bram stopped where he was and raised one hand, palm open, not like a command, but like a promise that he would not come closer than needed. "Just tea," he said. "Maybe water first." Marin nodded. It was a small motion, almost lost in the shaking of her body. Bram moved to the kitchen with slow, ordinary purpose. He filled a glass with water and set the kettle back on the stove. He took 2 clean towels from a drawer near the sink, then paused and opened a lower cabinet where he kept an old emergency kit. There were bandages, hand warmers, a flashlight, 2 protein bars, and a packet of cocoa he had forgotten buying. It struck him as strange that he could remember procedures for car wrecks and missing persons calls, but had to think twice about how to comfort a wet child in his own living room. He brought the water first and placed it on the low table near Marin, far enough that she would not feel crowded. Then he handed her the towels. She accepted them with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Bram nodded once. He did not ask where she had come from. He did not ask why one of Junie's shoes was missing. He did not ask why the child's eyes kept moving toward the window as if expecting the glass to become a face. Those questions had their time, and this was not it. People who had just escaped danger needed a place where no one demanded the whole story before offering a blanket. Junie watched Bravo from behind the edge of the wool. The dog had not moved from the door. The firelight touched the gray around his muzzle and made him look older than he was, like a tired captain guarding a harbor no ship could enter. After a while, his tail gave one slow thump against the floor, not playful, not careless, just enough to tell the child he knew she was there. Junie leaned closer to Marin. "Is he mad?" she whispered. Bram heard her, though he pretended to be checking the stove. "No," he answered gently. "He is listening." Junie's eyes widened a little. "To what?" "To the storm," Bram said, then looked at Bravo, "and to anything pretending to be part of it." Marin closed her eyes for a second as if that answer had cut too close to the truth. When the kettle began to tremble, Bram poured hot water into 2 mugs, stirred cocoa into one for Junie, and left the other plain for Marin. He set both on the table and stepped back. Junie looked at the cocoa as if it had arrived from another world. "It is not too hot if you sip slow," Bram said. Junie reached for it only after Marin touched the mug first. She lifted it with both hands. The first sip left a faint brown mark on her upper lip, and for one brief second she looked like a child again instead of a little bird blown against the wrong window. Marin saw it too. Her face tightened, not from anger, but from the effort of holding back tears. She rubbed Junie's hair with the towel, moving carefully around a small scrape near the child's temple. Bram saw the scrape. He saw the red mark on Marin's wrist where fingers had likely held too hard. He let his eyes pass over them without staring. The old police part of him began arranging facts anyway. Mother and child arrived on foot in heavy rain. No bag, 1 shoe missing. Vehicle seen below the ridge. Child says, "He found us again." Husband or partner likely. Pattern repeated. Immediate danger possible. He did not write any of it down, but the list formed in his mind like an incident report made of firelight and silence. Marin set her water down with a soft click. "We should go." Bram looked at her. "No." "You do not understand," she said quickly. "If he knows we came here, he will come to the door. If he sees your truck, if he sees your badge, if he thinks you are helping me, he will make this your problem too." "It already knocked on my door," Bram said. Her mouth trembled. "I should not have brought Junie here. I saw the light on the hill and I just kept walking. I did not know this was your house until I was almost on the porch." Bram believed that. Panic did not make maps. It followed light. "Who is he?" Bram asked, keeping his voice even. Marin looked at Junie. The girl had gone very still, both hands wrapped around the cocoa mug. "My husband," Marin said at last. "Orrin Vale." The name sat heavily in the cabin. Orrin Vale was 39 years old, a local mechanic who worked when he wanted to and smiled when people were watching. Bram knew the face. He had seen Orrin at gas stations, at the hardware store, once at the county fair with one arm around Marin's shoulders and the other hand resting too firmly on Junie's back. Men like Orrin often knew how to look harmless in public. They used politeness like fresh paint over rotten wood. Bram did not say any of that aloud. "Has he hurt you tonight?" Marin swallowed. "Not tonight." The answer was worse than yes. It carried history. Junie lowered her mug. "Mama?" she whispered. Marin drew a breath and stood, still holding the blanket around Junie. "We have to leave before he comes up here. If we keep moving, maybe he will think we went toward town." Bravo rose before she took 2 steps. The movement was smooth and immediate. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stepped away from the door and placed himself directly in front of Marin, blocking the path with the full weight of his body. His head was high. His eyes were calm. His message was unmistakable. Marin stopped. Junie stared at the dog. Bram did too. "Bravo," Bram said softly. The dog did not look back. Marin tried to move around him. Bravo shifted with her, gentle but firm, like a gate that had chosen to stay closed. Junie clutched her mother's hand. "He won't let us go," the girl said. "No," Bram said, watching his old partner stand between fear and the front door. "He won't." Marin looked at Bram then, and for the first time since she had crossed the threshold, her face showed something besides terror. It showed exhaustion so deep it had become almost surrender. "I can't keep running," she said. Bram felt those words settle in the room. They were not dramatic. They were not loud. They were the plain truth of a woman whose strength had been spent 1 mile at a time. Outside, thunder rolled over the ridge. The windows trembled. Somewhere below the hill, a vehicle engine rose faintly, then faded again into the rain. Bravo's ears sharpened, but he held his place. Bram walked to the front door and checked the deadbolt. Then he moved to the side window, closed the curtain, and did the same to the kitchen window. He did not rush. He wanted Marin and Junie to see each action: door locked, windows covered, fire burning, dog watching, no one panicking. When he came back, Marin was still standing as if waiting for permission to collapse. Bram looked at her, then at Junie, then at Bravo. "Sit back down," he said. "Drink what you can. Warm up." Marin hesitated. "Officer Calloway." "Bram," he corrected, not sharply. She blinked. He lowered his voice. "Tonight, no one has to run anymore." For a long moment, Marin did not move. Then her knees seemed to give up before her pride did. She sank back onto the couch, pulling Junie beside her. Junie set the cocoa on the table and leaned into her mother, eyes fixed on Bravo as if the old dog were a wall built by mercy itself. Bram took his place near the window, not in uniform, not officially on duty, but more awake than he had been in weeks. Down in Ashford Ridge, Alma Wren stood behind the counter of her diner with the phone pressed to her ear. Alma was 67, the owner of Wren's Diner, and a woman who trusted silence only when it belonged to prayer, sleep, or pie cooling on a windowsill. This silence around Marin and Junie belonged to none of those things. She had called Patty at the laundromat, then George at the market, then a retired school secretary named Lorna Bell who knew nearly every family in 3 counties. All of them said the same thing in different ways. Maybe Marin was visiting relatives. Maybe Junie had a cold. Maybe Alma was worrying over nothing. And when Alma mentioned Orrin Vale, people softened their voices. "He always seemed polite," Patty said. "Hard worker when he wants to be," George added. "Family matters are complicated," Lorna murmured. Alma looked at the empty booth by the window where Junie used to draw on napkins while Marin counted coins for coffee. "Complicated is what people call trouble when they don't want to look at it," Alma said. She hung up before Lorna could answer. For a while, Alma stood with her hand still on the phone. Rain covered the diner windows. The ceramic rooster by the register stared back at her with its foolish painted smile. Alma thought of Junie waving at that rooster every Thursday, and of Marin smiling like a woman apologizing for needing a cup of soup. No, Alma did not believe they were fine. Not for a minute. On the mountain, Bram heard Bravo give one quiet huff and lower himself again in front of the door. Marin and Junie sat wrapped together by the fire. For the moment, the cabin held. The storm had brought them there, but Bravo had made the first decision. Bram understood that now. His old partner had heard something beneath the rain that men often missed. Not just danger, not just pursuit. He had heard the sound of two lives reaching the end of the road, and he had refused to let them step back into the dark. Morning came to the Blue Ridge Mountains with a pale gray light and the tired smell of rain-soaked earth. The storm had weakened before dawn, leaving the trees dripping, the gravel road washed clean, and the cabin wrapped in the kind of silence that follows a long night of fear. Inside, the fire had burned low. Marin Vale sat on the couch with Junie asleep against her side, both of them still tucked beneath Bram's old blankets. Bravo lay in front of the door, his head resting on his paws, but Bram knew the dog was not truly sleeping. Every small sound made one of his ears move. Bram Calloway had not slept either. The 42-year-old police officer had spent most of the night in the chair near the window, listening to the house settle and the mountain breathe. He had removed his badge from the table twice and put it back twice, as if the small piece of metal could decide what kind of man he was supposed to be. He was still on leave. He was not supposed to involve himself in trouble. Yet trouble had come carrying a barefoot child through a storm, and no rulebook had ever taught him how to close the door on that. Just after 7, Bram stepped into the kitchen and started coffee. He moved quietly, careful not to wake Junie. The little girl looked younger in sleep, her hand curled into the blanket as if she were holding on to the edge of a dream. Marin's eyes opened the moment the kettle touched the stove. Fear had trained her to wake quickly. "You're safe," Bram said before she could ask. Marin nodded, but her gaze went to the windows. "For now." Bram did not argue. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and carried it to the side window. The morning fog hung low between the pines. At first he saw only wet branches and the narrow track of his gravel road bending down toward the creek. Then Bravo lifted his head. The dog did not growl yet. He only stood, slow and certain, and walked to the door with his nose slightly raised. His black and tan coat caught the weak light from the window. The gray around his muzzle made him look almost ancient, but the alertness in his body was sharp as a drawn line. Bram followed the direction of Bravo's attention. Far below the cabin, near the place where the road widened beside a cluster of laurel bushes, an old pickup truck sat half-hidden by mist. Its paint was dark, dulled by age and weather. Mud covered the tires. The engine was off, but the truck had not been there the night before. Marin stood so fast the blanket slipped from her shoulders. Bram turned. "Do you know that truck?" Her face had gone colorless. "It's his." Junie stirred on the couch, but did not wake. Marin pressed a hand over her mouth and looked as if the whole mountain had tilted beneath her feet. Bram set the coffee down. "Stay away from the windows." "He found us," Marin whispered. "I told you. He always finds us." Bram crossed the room and took his dark police jacket from the hook near the door. The jacket was worn at the cuffs and carried the faint smell of rain, leather, and old patrol cars. He put it on without reaching for his sidearm. He did not need to make the room more afraid than it already was. "Marin," he said, keeping his voice even, "take Junie into the hallway. Stay behind the wall until I tell you otherwise." She looked at him as if she wanted to say no, as if she wanted to grab her daughter and run again. Then Bravo stepped closer to her. Not blocking this time, simply standing near enough to remind her that running was not the only choice left. Marin woke Junie with a gentle touch and guided her toward the hallway. Junie rubbed her eyes, saw Bram's jacket, and immediately understood that the night was not over. Outside, footsteps came up the porch stairs. They were slow, too slow for a worried husband, too calm for a man searching in panic. Each step landed with a deliberate weight, as if the person wanted those inside to hear him coming. A knock sounded at the door. Bram stood facing it. Bravo stood at his left side, head low, shoulders tense. The dog's growl started softly, not loud enough to shake the room, but deep enough to make the wooden floor seem to listen. Bram opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. Orrin Vale stood on the porch. He was 39 years old, a local mechanic from Ashford Ridge and Marin's husband, known around town as a man who could fix engines, shake hands with church elders, and smile politely when people were watching. That morning, he wore a wet canvas jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. His expression was carefully arranged into concern, but his eyes did not match it. They were cold, steady, and irritated by the fact that someone had opened the door instead of obeying him. "Morning," Orrin said. His voice was soft, almost friendly. "Sorry to bother you this early. I'm looking for my wife and little girl. They had a rough night." Bram did not answer right away. He let the silence sit there between them. Orrin glanced past him, trying to see into the cabin. "Marin gets overwhelmed sometimes. She takes things the wrong way. I'm sure she came up here upset, and I appreciate you helping, but Junie needs to go home." Bravo's growl deepened. Orrin's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Bram. "That dog's safe." "He is trained," Bram said. "That's not what I asked. It is the answer you need." The polite mask on Orrin's face tightened, but only for a second. Then he smiled again. It was a thin smile, one Bram had seen before on men who believed charm was a key that opened every locked door. "Look, Officer Calloway," Orrin said, placing gentle emphasis on the title. "I know who you are. I know you've had a hard time lately. Folks talk. I'm not here to cause trouble. My wife is not well right now, and my daughter is scared because her mother dragged her through the rain. Let me take them home, and nobody needs to make this bigger than it is." Behind Bram, from the hallway, Junie made the smallest sound. It was not a cry. It was a breath caught too quickly. Bravo heard it. Bram heard it. Orrin heard it too, and his eyes sharpened. "They're here," Orrin said. Bram's hand stayed on the door. "You are not coming in." "She is my wife. Not without her permission. That is my child. Not without a court order." Orrin took one step forward. It was small, almost casual, but his boot crossed the line where the porch met the threshold. Bravo moved before Bram spoke. The German shepherd's body surged into the narrow opening, not lunging, not attacking, simply filling the space with disciplined warning. His teeth showed for one brief moment, white in the gray morning. Orrin froze. Bram's voice remained calm. "You cannot enter this home without a warrant, an invitation, or an emergency that gives you lawful cause. You have none of those." The smile vanished from Orrin's face. For the first time, the man on the porch looked exactly like what Marin feared. Not loud, not wild, just controlled, angry, and certain that the world had denied him something he owned. "You want to be careful," Orrin said quietly. "You're on leave, aren't you? People might wonder why a suspended officer is hiding another man's family in his cabin." "I am not suspended," Bram said, "and they are not hidden. They are safe." The words struck Orrin harder than any shout would have. His jaw shifted. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his cap onto the porch boards. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, forcing the polite tone back into place. "Marin will calm down. Junie will want her own bed. You do not know what you are getting involved in." Bram looked at him through the narrow opening. "I know enough." For several seconds neither man moved. The mountains seemed to hold their breath. Then Orrin stepped back. He lifted both hands slightly, as if he were the reasonable one ending an unpleasant conversation. "All right," he said. "I'll give her time." But his eyes moved past Bram toward the hallway. He could not see Junie, but he knew she was there. Bram saw the look and felt his body go still. It was not the look of a man leaving. It was the look of a man memorizing where to return. Oren turned and walked down the porch steps. He did not hurry. He crossed the wet yard, climbed into the old pickup below the cabin, and started the engine. Before driving away, he looked back at the house through the windshield. Even from that distance, Bram felt the threat in it. Some men retreated only to choose a better hour. The truck rolled down the gravel road and disappeared into the fog. Bram closed the door and slid the deadbolt into place. Bravo remained beside him, still watching the wood as if he could see through it. Maren stepped from the hallway with Junie pressed close against her. "He won't stop," she said. Bram looked at the road below, then at the child hiding against her mother's side. "Then we do this the right way," he said, "but not while you are cold, hungry, and terrified." Down in Ashford Ridge, Alma Wren unlocked the front door of her diner for the morning crowd. Alma, 67, was the owner of Wren's Diner and had been feeding half the county long enough to know when an empty booth meant more than bad weather. As she swept beneath the table Maren and Junie usually shared, the broom struck something wedged against the wall. It was Junie's drawing notebook. Alma picked it up and brushed dust from the cover. She told herself she should not open it. Then she thought of the missing child, the worried mother, and Oren Vale's too-perfect smile. She opened it anyway. Most pages held birds, flowers, crooked houses, and one round rooster that looked suspiciously like the ceramic bird near Alma's register. But the last drawing made Alma's hand tighten around the notebook. It showed a dark doorway, a large man standing in front of it, and a woman holding a little girl behind her. Between them and the darkness lay a big dog, drawn with careful black and brown lines, guarding them from a shadow with long arms. Alma stared at the picture while rain tapped softly on the diner windows. "Well," she murmured to herself, "that is not the drawing of a child who feels safe." And up on the mountain, as Bravo finally sat beside the door, Bram understood the same thing. Oren Vale had walked away for now, but the danger had not gone. It had only learned the shape of the house. By late morning, the mountain had begun to steam beneath the weak autumn sun. Rainwater slipped from the pine branches in slow silver drops, and mist drifted between the trees like smoke from some ancient sleeping campfire. Inside Bram Calloway's cabin the air was warmer, but the danger from the morning had not fully left. It lingered in the corners, in the closed curtains, and in the way Maren Vale kept glancing toward the front door even after Oren's truck had vanished down the road. Bram stood at the kitchen counter, pouring fresh coffee he did not truly want. He was a 42-year-old police officer, still on leave, still carrying more silence than any man should have to carry. His dark police jacket hung on the back of a chair now, but its presence seemed to watch the room as much as he did. Maren sat near the fireplace with Junie beside her. Maren was 34, a mother who had learned to measure every sound before trusting it. Junie, her 7-year-old daughter, sat wrapped in a blanket with her knees pulled close, one hand holding the mug of cocoa Bram had warmed again for her. Bravo lay beside the old armchair near the fire. The 8-year-old German Shepherd had finally moved away from the door, but only after Bram checked the windows twice and locked the back entrance. The dog's black and tan coat had dried in uneven patches, and the gray around his muzzle gave him the solemn look of an old soldier listening to a war drum only he could hear. He did not crowd Junie. He did not sniff at her hands or push his head into her lap. He simply rested close enough for her to know he was there. For a long while, nobody said much. The cabin settled around them with small wooden sounds. The fire clicked. Wind breathed under the eaves. Junie kept watching Bravo over the rim of her mug. Each time the dog's eyes met hers, she looked away quickly, but not with the same terror as before. It was more like shyness now, the fragile kind that appears when fear is tired but not gone. Bravo lifted his head and placed his muzzle on the edge of the armchair cushion, only a few inches from Junie's blanket. He did it slowly, as if asking permission from someone who had never been asked for permission often enough. Junie froze. Marin's hand moved instinctively to her daughter's shoulder, but Bram raised his eyes from the counter and gave the smallest shake of his head. "He won't hurt her," Bram said softly. Junie stared at the dog's broad head. Bravo's brown eyes were steady, patient, and calm. He looked nothing like the danger outside. He looked like a wall that had learned how to breathe. After nearly a minute, Junie stretched out one finger. It hovered above Bravo's muzzle, trembling in the air. The dog did not move. The finger touched the soft fur between his eyes and pulled back at once. Bravo gave one slow thump of his tail against the floor. Junie blinked. Then she touched him again. This time, her hand stayed. "He's warm," she whispered. Bram leaned against the counter with his arms folded. "Usually too warm. He steals half the fire in winter." Junie looked up at him, uncertain whether that was meant to be funny. Bram was not entirely sure himself. Humor had grown rusty in him, like an old hinge on a door no one opened anymore. Junie looked back at Bravo. "He looks like a knight." "A knight?" Marin asked, her voice still tired but gentler than before. Junie nodded. "A knight with fur." The words landed softly in the cabin. Bram surprised himself by laughing. It was not loud, and it did not last long. It came out rough, almost unused, but real enough that Marin looked at him. For one small second, the cabin felt less like a shelter under siege and more like a place where people could sit near a fire while an old dog received a royal title from a child in a blanket. Bravo accepted the honor with complete seriousness. He closed his eyes and rested his chin more heavily on the chair, as if guarding kingdoms had always been part of his schedule. Marin watched Junie's fingers move slowly through the dog's fur. Something in her face softened, but it did not become peace. Peace was still too far away. What came instead was grief, thin and quiet. The grief of a mother seeing her child comforted by a stranger's dog because home had stopped being safe. Bram saw it. He set his coffee down. "Marin," he said, "we need to talk now." She looked toward Junie. Bram understood. "Only what you can say. Only what matters for keeping you safe." Marin took a long breath. "I tried to leave before." Bram opened the drawer beside the stove and pulled out a small black notebook. It was old, the corners bent, the pages filled with years of neat police shorthand. He took a pen from the same drawer and sat at the kitchen table, not too close to her, not too far. There was no recorder, no bright light, no hard chair across from a desk, just a notebook, a tired officer, and a woman trying to turn fear into words. "How many times?" Bram asked. "3," Marin said. "The first time, I went to my cousin in Roanoke. Orrin found out through a friend. He came there with flowers and apologies. Everyone thought it was romantic." She gave a small, empty smile. "It was not romantic." Bram wrote without interrupting. "The second time I saved enough cash for a motel near Waynesboro. He found the receipt in my coat before I left. The third time I made it 2 days. He told people I was confused, that Junie needed routine, that he was just worried." Junie's hand stopped moving on Bravo's head. She had heard more than they wanted her to. Bravo opened his eyes and nudged her blanket with his nose, drawing her attention back to him. Junie resumed stroking his fur, slower now. Bram kept his voice low. "Has he threatened you?" Marin looked at the fire. "Yes." "Has he threatened Junie?" Her silence answered first. Then she nodded. Bram wrote that down, too. Each word felt heavy, but the notebook gave it shape. Dates, places, witnesses, patterns. A frightened story could be dismissed by people who did not want to listen, but details were harder to sweep away. Details could become protection. Details could become evidence. Marin watched the pen move. "Do you believe me?" Bram looked up. "Yes." The answer was immediate. No decoration. No doubt. Marin's face changed as if she had been holding her breath for years and had finally been given permission to let some of it out. "I don't want to ruin his life," she whispered. "I just want ours back." Bram closed the notebook halfway, keeping his finger between the pages. "Keeping you and Junie safe is not ruining his life. It is stopping him from ruining yours." Marin lowered her head. Junie leaned against Bravo's neck, and the old dog allowed it, still as stone, gentle as a prayer. Far below the cabin, in Ashford Ridge, Alma Wren made her decision with the speed of a woman who had lived too long to mistake worry for nonsense. Alma was 67, the owner of Wren's Diner, and the sort of person who believed pie could fix many things but not all things. Junie's drawing notebook lay on the counter beside a brown paper bag holding 2 thick slices of apple pie, a jar of chicken soup, and a folded dish towel she did not need but packed anyway. She stared at the last drawing again. The big dog, the mother, the little girl, the shadow at the door. Then she tucked the notebook under her arm, grabbed her raincoat, and locked the diner behind her. Anyone who came looking for breakfast would have to survive without her biscuits for an hour. The world would not collapse, though a few men in town might act as if it had. Alma climbed into her old blue sedan and started toward the mountain road. She did not know exactly what she would find at Bram Calloway's cabin. She only knew Marin had disappeared, Junie had left behind a drawing no child should have needed to make, and Orrin Vale had smiled too smoothly the last time Alma asked after them. That was enough. Back in the cabin, Bram finished writing and tore a clean page from the back of the notebook. He wrote down a number and slid it across the table to Marin. "This is a women's shelter 2 counties over," he said. "Not local, not easy for Orrin to reach. We will call when you are ready." Marin stared at the paper. "You say that like I have a choice." "You do," Bram said. "Maybe not as many as you should, but more than he wants you to believe." The words settled gently, but they had weight. Marin folded the paper once and held it in her palm as if it were something fragile and holy. Junie, still leaning against Bravo, looked at Bram. "Can the night come too?" Bram looked at Bravo. The dog's eyes lifted toward him, calm and knowing, as if he had been waiting for the question all along. "We'll see," Bram said. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was the first answer in a long time that did not sound like a door closing. Outside, the mist lifted from the trees, and pale sunlight touched the wet porch where Orrin had stood that morning. The boards were empty now. For the moment, the danger had retreated beyond the hill. Inside the cabin, a little girl rested her cheek against an old police dog. A mother held a folded phone number like a map out of darkness, and Bram Calloway opened his notebook again because this time, fear was no longer just a whisper. This time, it had a witness. The drawing began with a yellow sun. Junie Vale sat at Bram Calloway's kitchen table with her knees tucked under her, a blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and a pencil held in the careful grip of a child trying to make something beautiful while the world outside remained uncertain. Alma Wren had arrived an hour earlier in her old blue sedan, carrying Junie's forgotten notebook, 2 slices of apple pie, a jar of chicken soup, and the firm expression of a 67-year-old diner owner who had decided that waiting quietly was no longer a virtue. She had not asked permission to care. She had simply walked in, set the food on the counter, looked at Bram, and said, "You look like a man who has been surviving on coffee and guilt." Bram had not answered, mostly because she was right. The cabin felt different with Alma inside it. She moved through the room as if she had known its shadows for years, warming soup, finding bowls, and speaking to Marin Vale in a voice that did not pity her. Marin, 34 years old and still pale from the long night behind her, sat near the stove with both hands around a mug of tea. She looked less like a woman about to run and more like someone who had finally found a chair solid enough to hold her. Bravo, the 8-year-old German shepherd who had become the cabin's living gate, lay beside Junie's chair with his head resting on his paws. Every so often, Junie reached down to touch the soft fur between his ears. Each time she did, Bravo's tail moved once, slow and patient, as if accepting another small medal from the kingdom of childhood. Bram stood near the window, watching the gravel road through a narrow gap in the curtain. He was 42, a police officer on leave, but that morning he felt older than the mountains. The notebook on his table held Marin's first clear account of what Orrin Vale had done, where he had followed her, and how often people had mistaken control for concern. It should have made Bram feel useful. Instead, it opened an older wound. Marin and Junie had come to his door because they were desperate, and desperation had a sound Bram knew too well. It sounded like radio static at midnight. It sounded like a dispatcher trying to stay calm. It sounded like a child's name repeated over and over until it stopped being a name and became a prayer. Months earlier, Bram had answered a call that still lived inside him. A little boy had been reported missing near an old trailer road outside Ashford Ridge. The boy was 6 years old, frightened of storms, and known to hide when adults shouted. The first location sent to Bram had been wrong, confused by a similar road name and heavy rain that blurred every landmark. By the time Bram and Bravo reached the right place, the search had stretched too long. They found the child alive, cold, and terrified beneath a collapsed porch, but Bram had never forgiven himself for the delay. The boy recovered. Everyone told Bram that. His captain told him the mistake was not his. Dispatch told him the weather had scrambled half the county's calls that night. The boy's grandmother even sent a thank you card with a shaky blue heart drawn in the corner. None of it changed the truth Bram carried. For 1 hour too long, a child had been alone in the dark, calling for help that had not arrived. Since then, Bram had followed procedures because procedures did not ask him to believe in mercy. He filed reports, checked locks, returned calls, and went through the motions with the steady discipline of a man walking across ice. But something in him had gone quiet. He had stopped trusting the idea that one person could change the ending of a story already bending towards sorrow. When Marin knocked on his door, he had almost seen another case file instead of a mother. When Junie whispered that someone had found them again, he had heard the echo of the boy beneath the porch. That was why he had not slept. Not only because Orrin was dangerous, but because Bram was afraid of being late again. At the table, Junie added a roof to the house in her drawing. It was Bram's cabin, though she made it kinder than it was. She gave it straight windows, a bright chimney, and a porch that looked strong enough to hold the whole sky. Then she drew 4 figures in front of it. One was tall, with a square body and a dark jacket. One had long hair and stood beside a smaller girl. The last was Bravo, drawn much too large with big paws and a serious face. Above them, the sun shone in yellow circles that filled half the page. Junie slid the drawing across the table. "This is for you." Bram looked at it but did not pick it up right away. The room seemed to quiet around the paper. He saw himself there, standing in front of the cabin, not as a failed officer, not as a man on leave, not as someone haunted by one wrong road in a storm. In Junie's drawing, he was simply the person who had opened the door. Children had a strange power that way. They could name a man by the one good thing he did before he remembered all the reasons he did not deserve the name. Bram picked up the paper carefully. "You made Bravo bigger than the house." "He has to be," Junie said. "He is guarding everybody." Alma, who was pouring soup into bowls, gave a soft laugh. "That dog has always had the attitude of a courthouse statue." Bravo blinked, unimpressed by criticism. For the first time that morning, Marin smiled. It was small, and it did not erase her fear, but it changed the room. Bram felt it like a match struck in a cave. He looked again at Junie's sun, bright and impossible above the cabin, and something inside him shifted. It was not healing. Healing was too large a word for one drawing. It was more like breath returning to a room after the windows had been sealed for too long. While Junie colored the sun darker, Alma sat beside Maren and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "I called Grace Harbor House," she said. "It is a women's support organization in the next county. They can help with shelter, legal guidance, and a safe plan. I spoke with Ruth Ellery, a 58-year-old intake coordinator who sounded like she could organize a rescue mission with one hand and bake biscuits with the other." Maren stared at the paper. Her fingers hovered over it, afraid to touch hope too quickly. "What did you tell her?" "Enough," Alma said. "Not everything. That is yours to tell, but enough for her to know this is serious." Bram looked toward Alma. "You should not have had to do that." Alma turned on him with the full force of a woman who had corrected farmers, truckers, pastors, and hungry teenagers for 4 decades. "And you should not have to carry the whole world because you wear a badge. Yet here we are." Bram looked down. Alma softened, but only slightly. "Listen to me, Bram Calloway. Sometimes saving somebody does not come with sirens. Sometimes it is not a chase, not a dramatic speech, not a perfect report signed at the perfect hour. Sometimes saving somebody is just not closing the door when they knock." The words found the place inside him that the old case had hollowed out. Bram did not answer because his throat had tightened, and he did not trust his voice. He looked at Junie's drawing again. The cabin, the yellow sun, Maren and Junie standing beside him, Bravo guarding them all like a furry knight who had somehow understood the assignment better than any adult in the room. Maren folded the paper from Grace Harbor House and placed it in the pocket of her sweater. It was only a phone number, only a beginning, but she held herself differently after that. Not safe yet, not free yet, but no longer entirely alone. Bram walked to the refrigerator and placed Junie's drawing beneath a small magnet shaped like a trout, the kind tourists bought from mountain gift shops. The paper fluttered once, then settled against the metal door. It looked almost out of place in the cabin, too bright for a room built around silence. Bram stepped back and studied it. Junie watched him. "Do you like it?" Bram nodded. "Very much." "Good," she said, "because you looked sad." Alma glanced toward the ceiling as if asking heaven to be gentle with men who could survive danger, but not honest children. Maren reached for Junie's hand, but Bram surprised them all by smiling. It was brief, uneven, and unfamiliar on his face. Still, it was there. Outside, the mountain road remained empty. Orrin had not returned. Not yet, but inside the cabin, something had changed in a way no threat could fully undo. Fear had become testimony. A phone number had become a possible road forward. A child's drawing had become a mirror, and in it Bram saw not the officer who had arrived late months ago, but the man who had opened the door in time. For the first time since the old case, Bram Calloway allowed himself to believe that maybe a life was not measured only by the rescue that failed. Maybe it could also be measured by the one still unfolding in front of him. Night returned to the mountain with rain in its teeth. By sunset, the pale break in the weather had closed again, and the Blue Ridge disappeared behind a moving wall of mist, wind, and cold water. Bram Calloway's cabin stood at the end of the gravel road with its curtains drawn and its porch light glowing like one small lantern against a very large darkness. Inside, Maren Vale sat at the kitchen table with a blanket around her shoulders, listening while Alma Wren spoke quietly on the phone with Grace Harbor House. Junie had fallen asleep on the couch, one hand resting on Bravo's thick fur, as if the old German shepherd were a living shield between her dreams and the world outside. Bram did not pretend the danger had passed. The 42-year-old police officer moved through the cabin with calm purpose, checking locks, testing the back door, setting a flashlight near the cellar hatch, and keeping his voice low enough not to frighten Junie. His badge lay on the kitchen counter beside his notebook, but he was not thinking about pride or procedure now. He was thinking about time, distance, and how long it would take help to climb the road if Orrin Vale decided to return. Alma watched him from beside the stove. She was 67, the owner of Wren's Diner, and a woman who believed worry should be given something useful to do. That was why she had already called Sheriff Ellis Rook in the neighboring county. Ellis Rook was 54 years old, a steady and respected sheriff known for answering his own phone after hours and for treating domestic threats as real danger instead of private inconvenience. Alma had known him since he was a thin young deputy who once ate 3 plates of her biscuits after a flood rescue and still tried to pay with wet dollar bills. "He said he'll send a unit this way if things turn strange," Alma told Bram. Bram looked toward the dark window. "They already turned strange." Before Alma could answer, the lights went out. The cabin fell into instant blackness. The refrigerator stopped humming. The small lamp near the couch vanished. Junie woke with a sharp little gasp, and Marin stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "Easy," Bram said at once. His voice cut through the darkness, steady and close. "Nobody move yet." Then Bravo rose. There was no confusion in the dog. The 8-year-old German Shepherd moved from sleep to full alert in a single breath. His head turned toward the back of the cabin, toward the mudroom and the rear door that opened near the woodpile. A low growl rolled out of him, deeper than thunder, older than fear. Junie whimpered. Marin reached for her daughter, but Bravo was already crossing the room, claws clicking against the boards. Bram picked up the flashlight and switched it on, keeping the beam low. "Marin, take Junie." "What happened?" Junie whispered. "Power's out," Bram said, "but we planned for that." It was not entirely true, but it sounded true enough to hold her panic back. From the rear of the cabin came a faint metallic sound. Not the wind, not a branch. Something careful touched the latch of the mudroom door. Bravo barked once. It was not a wild bark. It was a command, sharp and final. The sound filled the cabin and seemed to strike the walls awake. Bram moved fast but did not rush. He lifted the rug near the hallway and pulled up the old wooden hatch built into the floor. Beneath it was a small storm cellar, once used by the cabin's previous owner during tornado warnings and hard winters. Bram had cleaned it years earlier, but rarely used it. Now its narrow steps disappeared into darkness like the throat of the earth. "Marin," he said, "down there with Junie." Marin looked at the back door. "Bram." "Now." She obeyed because there was no time left to argue. She guided Junie down the steps first, wrapping the blanket around her. Junie clutched the edge of the hatch and looked up at Bram, her face pale in the flashlight glow. "I'm scared," she said. Bram crouched. He kept his voice even, almost gentle. "Listen to Bravo. Chung nauno con o jo, chao con an tuan." Junie blinked, not understanding the foreign phrase but understanding his eyes, his tone, and the dog barking behind him like a guardian at the gate. Bram repeated in English, softer now. "As long as you can hear Bravo, you are safe." Junie nodded once. Alma stepped toward the cellar too, but Bram caught her arm gently. "Go with them." Alma's mouth tightened. "Do not start acting noble at me, Bram Calloway. Please." That word did what commands could not. Alma went down the steps, muttering under her breath about stubborn men and inconvenient heroics. Bram lowered the hatch most of the way, leaving a small gap for air and sound. Then he turned toward the back of the house. The mudroom door shuddered. "Oren," Bram called out, his voice carrying cleanly through the dark cabin. "Step away from the door." For 1 second there was only rain. Then Oren Vale's voice answered from outside, stripped of the sweetness he had worn that morning. "Open it." Bram walked into the mudroom with Bravo at his side. The dog's shoulders were rigid, his ears forward, his body ready but controlled. Bram did not draw his weapon. He did not need to turn this into something Junie would remember in worse colors than she already had. He opened the inner mudroom door, leaving the locked screen and outer door between them. Lightning flashed across the yard. In that pale burst, Oren stood on the back step in a wet jacket, his face hard, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked less like a husband and more like a man whose mask had finally become too heavy to carry. Rain ran from the brim of his cap and down his jaw. "You are trespassing," Bram said. "She is my wife," Oren answered. "She is under my protection tonight." "You do not get to decide that." "No," Bram said. "She does." The words hung between them. Bravo growled again, and Oren took half a step back despite himself. Bram saw it. Fear did not make Oren harmless, but it made him less certain, and Bram needed every second that uncertainty could buy. "You cut the power," Bram said. "You came to the back door after being told not to return. You have threatened Maren before. You need to leave before this becomes worse." Oren laughed once, but it had no humor in it. "You think a dog and a badge on leave make you some kind of hero?" Bram stood in the dark doorway with rain blowing against his face. He was tired. His back ached. His eyes burned from too little sleep and too many memories. But he did not move aside. "No," he said. "I think they make me the person standing between you and them." A faint sound rose beneath the rain then. At first it was almost hidden by the wind. Then it grew clearer. Tires on wet gravel. More than one vehicle. Headlights slid between the trees at the lower bend of the road, then climbed toward the cabin in two steady beams. Oren turned his head. Bram did not. A sheriff's cruiser pulled into the yard, followed by a second county vehicle. Red and blue lights washed over the wet trees, the porch, the mud, and Oren's startled face. Sheriff Ellis Rook stepped out first. He was 54, broad-shouldered, calm under pressure, and dressed in a dark rain jacket over his uniform. Two deputies followed him, both uniformed officers from his county there to secure the scene and assist with the arrest. "Oren Vale," Sheriff Rook called. "Step away from the house and keep your hands where we can see them." Oren's face changed. The anger remained, but now it had nowhere safe to go. He looked once at Bram, once at Bravo, and then toward the flashing lights. For a moment, Bram thought he might try to talk his way out, to polish the mask and wear it again. But the cut power, the back door, the prior warning, and Maren's statement had already begun building a cage stronger than any lie. Sheriff Rook approached with measured steps. "You were told not to come back here tonight. We also have a report of threats, harassment, and an attempt to enter this residence without permission." "This is family business," Oren said. Rook's voice stayed level. "Not anymore." The deputies moved in. Oren resisted only with words, sharp and desperate, but the storm swallowed most of them. There was no struggle worth remembering, no grand display, no victory music in the rain. Just the quiet sound of handcuffs closing and a dangerous man finally being treated like a danger. When Oren was placed in the cruiser, Bram turned back toward the cabin. Bravo remained beside him until the car door shut. Only then did the old dog release a long breath and lower his head. From beneath the floor, Junie's small voice called, "Can we come out?" Bram closed his eyes for 1 second. "Yes," he said. "You can come out." Alma emerged first, hair damp from the cellar air and one hand gripping her crooked umbrella, though how she had managed to bring it down there was a mystery only heaven could explain. Maren followed with Junie wrapped in her arms. When Maren saw the cruiser lights through the rain and Oren inside the vehicle, her knees almost weakened, but Alma caught her with a firm hand. Sheriff Rook came to the doorway and nodded to Bram. "We will take him in. I will need Maren's full statement when she is ready, but not in a rush and not without support." Maren looked at him, then at Bram, then at Bravo. For the first time, the fear in her face had room to share space with relief. Alma stood in the rain beside Bram, her umbrella bent sideways by the wind. Her eyes were wet, though she would have blamed the weather if anyone asked. She looked at Bram and shook her head. "You are exactly the kind of man who makes a person want to thank you and throw apple pie at your head at the same time." Bram let out a tired breath that almost became a laugh. Bravo leaned against Junie's legs and the little girl placed both hands on his head. The rain kept falling, but the sound had changed. It was no longer the sound of something hunting through the dark. It was only weather now, washing the mountain clean. By morning, the storm had moved east and left the mountain washed clean. The air smelled of wet pine, wood smoke, and the quiet relief that comes after a long night has finally ended. Sheriff Ellis Rook drove Orrin Vale away before sunrise, and with him went the worst part of the darkness. Yet no one in Bram Calloway's cabin felt brave enough to call it over. Some dangers leave in handcuffs, but their shadows remain sitting in the room for a while, waiting to see if anyone will breathe again. Maren Vale and Junie were taken later that day to Grace Harbor House, the women's support organization in the next county. Ruth Ellery, the 58-year-old intake coordinator Bram had heard about from Alma, met them at the door with a calm voice, a clipboard, and the kind of eyes that had seen fear before without becoming cold to it. She did not rush Maren. She did not ask Junie too many questions. She simply showed them a small clean room with 2 beds, a lamp, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward a maple tree turning red at the edges. To Maren, it was not much. To Junie, it looked like a castle because the door locked from the inside. Bram drove them there in his truck with Alma Wren sitting in the passenger seat and Bravo stretched across the back seat beside Junie. The 8-year-old German shepherd had insisted on coming, though nobody said it that way. He had placed himself beside the truck door that morning and refused to move until Junie climbed in. Alma said he was stubborn. Bram said he was thorough. Junie said he was still a knight, which seemed to settle the matter. At Grace Harbor House, Maren thanked Bram in the parking lot. She was 34, exhausted, frightened, and standing on the edge of a life she had not yet learned how to trust. Her hands tightened around the small bag Ruth had given her for basic things: toothbrushes, soap, clean socks, a notebook for appointments. "I don't know how to repay you," she said. Bram looked uncomfortable, as if gratitude were a language he understood but could not speak. "You don't." Junie stood beside Bravo, one hand buried in the fur at his neck. She looked up at Bram. "Will he forget me?" Bravo answered before Bram could. He leaned his large head against Junie's side and sighed as if deeply offended by the question. Bram almost smiled. "No, he has a good memory." Junie nodded, but her eyes filled anyway. She hugged Bravo around the neck, pressing her face into his fur. The dog stood very still, accepting the embrace with the grave patience of an old officer receiving a medal in front of a crowd. Then Ruth led Maren and Junie inside, and the door closed gently behind them. Bram told himself that was good. He told himself the cabin would be quiet again, and quiet was what he had wanted. He drove back up the mountain that evening with Bravo beside him and Alma silent for once. When he dropped Alma at the diner, she gave him a look through the open truck window. "You are going to say you are fine," Alma said. "I am fine." That was fast. Try not to convince anyone too hard. Then she went inside before he could answer. The cabin felt larger when Bram returned. It was the same place it had been before Maren and Junie knocked on his door. The same wooden walls, the same stone fireplace, the same chair near the window. But the silence had changed shape. Before, Bram had thought of it as peace. That night, with the couch empty and the little mug washed and drying near the sink, the silence felt less like peace and more like a room holding its breath. Bravo noticed it too. The old German shepherd walked to the front door, sniffed the floor where rainwater from Maren's shoes had dried, then patted to the couch where Junie had slept. He circled once, lowered himself near the fireplace, and stared at the door. "She is safe," Bram said. Bravo did not look convinced. Bram sat in his chair and tried to open a book. The words blurred. He tried to review the notes in his black notebook. The facts were clear, but the room was not. Every few minutes his eyes drifted to Junie's drawing on the refrigerator. The yellow sun looked too bright for the cabin, and yet he could not bring himself to take it down. In the picture, he was standing beside Maren, Junie, and Bravo. In the room, he was alone. That was when Bram began to understand something he had avoided for years. The quiet life he had built after the old case had not healed him. It had only kept him from hearing anything new. Marin and Junie had not interrupted his peace. They had revealed his loneliness. A week passed, then 2. Orrin remained in custody while Sheriff Rook and Ruth Ellery helped Marin prepare statements, protective paperwork, and a plan that did not depend on luck. Marin began working part-time at Wren's Diner. Alma, 67 and proudly impossible to argue with, placed her behind the counter during slow afternoon hours, teaching her how to pour coffee before customers asked and how to smile only when she felt like it. A woman rebuilding her life should never be forced to smile over weak coffee, Alma declared while refilling 3 cups at once. Junie returned to school with a new backpack Ruth had found in a donation closet. Her teacher, Miss Clara Hensley, a 52-year-old elementary school teacher known for keeping peppermints in her desk and patience in her voice, let Junie sit near the window. Junie brought one drawing with her every day. Most were of trees, suns, and houses. But one picture stayed folded inside her backpack. Bravo, lying beneath a table, big paws crossed, watching the world with serious brown eyes. Bram started coming into town more often. At first, he had reasons: coffee, nails, batteries for the flashlight, a new latch for the back door, oil for the truck. Alma did not challenge any of these excuses directly. She only raised one eyebrow each time he walked into the diner with Bravo at his side and sat at the same booth where Junie did her homework after school. Junie always saw Bravo first. Her face would brighten, not wildly, but steadily, like a lamp being turned up. Bravo would move beneath her table and settle at her feet, large, watchful, and slightly too pleased with himself. The people in the diner noticed. Truckers lowered their voices. Teenagers stopped tossing straw wrappers. Even old Mr. Abernathy, a 73-year-old retired mail carrier who complained about everything from soup temperature to federal holidays, began stepping carefully around Junie's booth as if passing a sleeping judge. Marin changed slowly, the way spring changes a field after winter. She still startled at sudden sounds. She still looked at the door whenever a truck slowed outside, but her shoulders no longer stayed tight all day. She laughed once when Alma dropped a pie crust and blamed gravity in front of 3 customers. Junie began eating full meals again. Bram noticed these things because he had been trained to notice signs of danger, and now he was learning to notice signs of life. Alma noticed something else. People in town had begun to feel ashamed. Not all at once, not loudly, but in small ways. Patty from the laundromat brought Marin a basket of folded children's clothes. George from the market left a grocery gift card in an envelope with no name. Lorna Bell, the retired school secretary who had once said family matters were complicated, arrived at the diner with a box of school supplies and eyes that would not quite meet Marin's. Alma decided shame could be useful if given proper direction. She organized a small fundraiser at the diner on a Saturday evening. Nothing grand. Chicken stew, cornbread, pie slices, a jar near the register, and a handwritten sign that read, "For a fresh start." She did not put Marin's full story on display. She did not need to. By then, enough people knew they had looked away too long. Bram came late carrying a box of porch hinges he claimed to have bought by accident. Alma looked inside the box and found an envelope tucked between the metal parts. "You bought cash by accident, too?" she asked. Bram shrugged. "Could happen." Alma snorted but did not embarrass him by counting it. That evening, Junie sat in her usual booth, drawing Bravo with a sheriff's star on his collar. Bravo slept under the table, his paws stretched out, his ears twitching whenever the door opened. Marin moved between tables with a coffee pot, still quiet, still careful, but standing straighter than before. Bram watched from near the counter and felt something in his chest loosen. The town had not become perfect. No town ever did. But for one night, The people who had once called trouble complicated, put money in a jar, carried dishes to tables, and stood beside a mother and child without asking them to prove their pain again. When Bram drove back to the mountain later, the cabin was still quiet. But he left the porch light on. He told himself it was for the rain, or the road, or the old habit of safety. Bravo glanced at him from the passenger seat. "All right," Bram said. "Maybe it is for them." The dog rested his head against the window, satisfied. At the end of the gravel road, the old cabin waited with one warm light shining over the porch. It no longer looked like a place hiding from the world. It looked like a place ready to welcome someone home. A few months later, winter had loosened its grip on the Blue Ridge, and spring came carefully over the mountains, not all at once, but in small, brave signs. Grass returned along the fence lines. Wildflowers opened beside the gravel road. The creek below Bram Calloway's cabin ran clear and quick over the stones, carrying away the last brown leaves from the season that had changed everything. Marin Vale and Junie moved into a small white rental house less than a mile from Bram's cabin. It sat at the edge of a quiet pasture, with a narrow porch, a tin mailbox, and a patch of earth behind it that Marin immediately called a garden, even before anything had grown there. She did not move there because she was helpless. She moved there because, for the first time in years, the choice was hers. No one rushed her. No one told her what she should feel. Grace Harbor House helped with the paperwork, Alma Wren helped with furniture, and Bram helped by showing up with tools before anyone asked him to. Bram was still a 42-year-old police officer, still quieter than most people knew how to understand. But his silence had changed. It no longer felt like a closed door. It felt more like a man listening before he spoke. He fixed the loose porch step on Marin's house, repaired the fence along the side yard, and replaced a broken latch on the garden gate. He claimed every task was practical. Alma claimed he had developed a severe medical condition called helpfulness. Bram did not argue, mostly because Alma usually won arguments by exhausting everyone else. Marin began building her new life in steady pieces. She kept her part-time job at Wren's Diner, saved what she could, and learned how to make plans without whispering them. She planted tomatoes, beans, and rosemary behind the house. Some of the seedlings leaned crookedly in the wind, and one row of lettuce failed almost immediately, which Alma said was not tragedy, but salad with poor ambition. Marin laughed when she said it. The laugh was quiet, but it came easier now, like a song she was slowly remembering. Junie planted wildflowers along the path from the mailbox to the porch. She chose the seeds herself from the hardware store. Black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, and tiny blue forget-me-nots. She said the forget-me-nots were for the old scary days, not because she wanted to keep them, but because forgetting too quickly felt unfair to the girl she had been before. Marin listened and kissed the top of her head. Some wisdom comes out of children so simply that adults do not know where to put it. Bravo approved of the new house. The 8-year-old German Shepherd spent many afternoons in the middle of the yard, stretched in the sun with his black and tan coat shining and his gray muzzle resting on his paws. He was older now, slower to rise, and very dramatic about anyone disturbing his naps. But when a delivery truck came too close, or a stranger paused too long at the gate, his ears lifted and the old authority returned to him. He looked like a retired guardian who had given up chasing storms but not his oath to stand between danger and the people he loved. Bram visited often, usually with an excuse. He brought extra nails, spare boards, a bag of mulch, a flashlight battery, a jar of screws he insisted had no useful purpose at his own cabin. Junie saw through him by May. "You can just say you came to see us," she told him one afternoon while watering the wildflowers. Bram looked at Bravo, who was lying beside the porch like a witness for the prosecution. "I came to inspect the gate." Junie nodded very seriously. "The gate missed you." Marin turned away to hide her smile, but not quickly enough. Bram saw it and looked down at the toolbox as if the hinges had suddenly become fascinating. By late autumn, Ashford Ridge held its annual harvest festival in the town square. It was the kind of small-town event that smelled of kettle corn, hay bales, coffee, and cinnamon. Children painted pumpkins near the church steps. A bluegrass band played under a striped tent. Wren's Diner had a booth selling apple hand pies, which Alma guarded as if they were crown jewels. Alma was 67, still the owner of the diner, still bossy enough to direct traffic with a pie server if needed, and secretly softer than the crusts she pretended not to burn. Marin stood beside the diner booth, helping serve coffee. She looked different from the woman who had arrived at Bram's door in the rain. Not untouched by the past, but no longer ruled by it. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her eyes met people directly. When someone thanked her for the coffee, she smiled because she wanted to, not because fear had trained her to make others comfortable. Bram stood near the back of the crowd with Bravo sitting at his side. He had returned to duty weeks earlier, not because every wound had vanished, but because he had learned wounds did not have to be the only thing a person carried. His captain had welcomed him back without speeches. Bram preferred it that way. He still had quiet days. He still thought about the old case. But now, when the memory came, it did not arrive alone. It stood beside another memory. A cabin door opening in the rain, a child safe by the fire, and a dog refusing to let fear walk back into the dark. Near the small wooden stage, Junie waited with her school paper folded in both hands. She was 7 years old, a little taller now, wearing a yellow sweater Marin had bought from a second-hand shop and a barrette shaped like a daisy. Her teacher, Miss Clara Hensley, the 52-year-old elementary school teacher who had helped Junie feel safe at school again, stood nearby and gave her an encouraging nod. When Junie stepped to the microphone, the crowd quieted. Bram felt Bravo lean lightly against his leg. Junie unfolded her paper. Her voice shook at first, but it grew stronger as she read. Family is not always the place where you are born. Sometimes family is the place where somebody opens the door when you are scared. Sometimes it is a quiet police officer, a dog as big as a bear, and a house that keeps a light on when the dark feels too big. Marin pressed one hand to her mouth. Alma stopped arranging pies. Bram looked down quickly, but it was too late. His eyes had already betrayed him. They shone in the cold festival air. Junie continued. I used to think brave meant not being afraid. Now I think brave means being afraid and still letting someone kind help you. My mom is brave. Officer Bram is brave. Miss Alma is brave, even when she yells about biscuits. And Bravo is brave because he knew we were family before the rest of us did. The crowd laughed softly at the line about Alma, and Alma pointed at Junie as if pretending to be offended. But she was crying too. When Junie finished, the applause came warm and long. Marin hugged her daughter at the edge of the stage. Bravo rose and walked forward with slow dignity, as if he understood this was his moment as much as hers. Junie dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around his neck. The old dog closed his eyes and leaned into her. Bram stood behind the crowd, wiping one hand across his face. Alma appeared beside him with a folded napkin. Strange wind today, she said. Bram took the napkin without looking at her. Cold air. Very strange, Alma said. Only seems to hit stubborn men in the eyes. Bram let out a quiet laugh. This time it did not sound rusty. It sounded alive. That evening, after the festival, they returned to Marin's little house near the pasture. Bram checked the porch light before leaving, but Junie stopped him at the gate. You can stay for supper, she said. Mom made soup. Alma said it is almost legal. Marin stood on the porch, smiling. Bravo had already chosen his place beside the front steps, clearly refusing to leave before supper was settled. Bram looked at the warm windows, the wildflowers gone to seed along the path, the repaired fence, and the small family waiting under the porch light. For years he had thought home was simply a place where pain could not reach him. Now he understood that home was sometimes the place where pain was allowed to heal. He walked back through the gate. Behind him, Bravo gave one satisfied thump of his tail against the porch boards. The dog had done what no report, badge, or quiet mountain cabin could do. He had chosen a family out of the rain and taught them how to stay. And under the soft yellow light of that little house, Marin found peace. Junie found her laughter. Bram found his way back to himself. And Bravo, the old police dog with a gray muzzle and a guardian's heart, finally rested like a hero whose watch had led everyone home. Sometimes the people who seem the quietest are carrying the loudest battles inside them. Bram Calloway thought his life had become nothing more than silence, old regrets, and an empty cabin at the end of a mountain road. Marin believed she had to keep running forever. Junie thought safety was something that disappeared when the lights went out. But Bravo saw what they could not see yet. He saw a family before they became one. This story reminds us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is a mother knocking on a stranger's door in the rain. Sometimes it is a tired officer opening that door even though his own heart is still wounded. Sometimes it is an old dog standing between fear and the people who need one more chance. In the end, Marin found freedom. Junie found her smile again. Bram found a reason to believe in himself. And Bravo proved that love does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it comes with muddy paws, a gray muzzle, and a growl in the dark. Maybe the greatest lesson is this: no one heals alone. We all need someone who leaves the light on, someone who believes us, and someone brave enough to stand beside us when the storm returns. What did you think about Bram, Marin, Junie, and Bravo's journey? Have you ever seen an animal change someone's life in a way people could not? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below.